Okay, so in this video, we will learn how to build a simple backend using Node.js. We'll be using Node.js for our web application framework. And the reason I chose Node.js is because the developer experience is phenomenal. There's no need to set up your own development environment. So if we decide to use something like Express.js, that means we have to install everything, right? We need to install Express.js. We need to install TypeScript if we're going to be using TypeScript. We need to install TSLint. We need to install Prettier. We need to install NodeMon for hot reloading. We need to think about what testing framework we're going to be using. There's just so much that you as a developer have to handle, which is annoying. And so this is why I chose Node.js, because all you need to do is install it and begin building your backend. Okay, so for our database, we will be using Supabase, which is a database built on top of Postgres. And Supabase is great because you don't have to do anything locally. You just create an account. It's all free. You don't have to worry about deploying a database. And as for the front end, in this video, we will not be building a front end. And for that reason, we will be using Insomnia for our API client, which is just used to design and test APIs. Okay, before we get started, we need to do a little bit of system design. Okay, so don't worry about all this stuff over here. We'll get to it in a bit. So in creating the backend, there are three key components that we need to consider. Whether we have a simple backend or a production level backend, at its core, this is what it's all about, right? Having a client, a server, or a backend, and a database. And so this diagram illustrates the response request cycle. Okay, and so from the client, we make a request to the server, and the server is always listening for incoming requests from the client. And almost always our server is hooked up to a database. So once our server receives that incoming request, let's just suppose that the user is trying to log in. So from within our backend code base or a server, we need to query the database. Once we query the database, then the database sends a result back to our backend. And again, from within our backend, now we're ready to send a response back to the client. Okay, now let's go ahead and take a look at the text off to the right-hand side. So typically when we set up a backend, either using Node.js or Express.js or any web application framework, we need to first initialize the app and then start adding routes, right? And to our routes, we can add middleware and controllers. And if you don't know what routes or middlewares or controllers are, middleware is just code that needs to run before sending a response to the client. And so typically this is where we put validation, right? We want to validate the user input or sanitize it before using that information to query our database. And the controller is just a function that sends a response to the client, right? This is where we decide if we send a 404 or a 200, along with its corresponding payload or data. Okay, so before we build our backends, I just want to point out a few things. So as I mentioned earlier, once our app has been initialized, our backend is always listening for incoming requests from the client. So in our case, our backend is built using Node.js. And so behind the scenes, Node.js, with the help of C++, will package this response and request object for us and expose both of these objects within our middleware and controllers. Okay, so what does this look like in action? So if I go over to the Express documentation, here's a very simple example using Express, right? We import the package, we initialize our app, and then here we're setting a route. And to that route, we're adding a controller, right? And so this request and response object, as I mentioned earlier, Node.js, with the help of C++ behind the scenes, is packaging this request and response object for us. And it will insert those two objects into our controllers and any middleware or any functions that we put in between our route and our controller. So this request and response, these two parameters, we can name them whatever we want. But by convention, it's always request and response. And so the reason I bring up the Express documentation, if you go over to Node.js and try to read through the documentation, it assumes that you know what middleware is, what controllers are, and what routes are. So if some of this is unclear, I would suggest you read some of the Express documentation. You can start maybe in the guide tab. Okay, so with that out of the way, I think we're ready to start building our backend. Okay, so I'll go ahead and follow this get started link. And if you scroll down, you'll see this quick start. So go ahead and just copy and paste this command and run it in my terminal. So here it'll create a directory for you. So we need to go ahead and just give it whatever name you want. And if you scroll down, you will see the Node.js option. So go ahead and select that option, and then go ahead and press yes to install the dependencies. And we're using, looks like npm is the only choice. So I'll just go ahead and select that. So now if I change into that directory, we see that we have everything that we need to get started. And it looks like by default, it's using TypeScript. So that's nice. Okay, so if we go ahead and open up this file, index.ts. So if we take a look, we have initialized the web server. Here we're doing a few things. So we are creating the / route, and on that route we are defining the get method. And finally, the last thing we're doing is creating a controller to handle incoming, if I can spell, incoming requests, more specifically, incoming get request to that route, right, /. And here we're just specifying a port. You know, you can just try whatever number and see if it works or not. Doesn't really matter for development purposes. And here we're just turning on the server. So this is what allows us to always be listening for these incoming get requests on this route /. Okay, so very quickly, I'll go ahead and let me see, start the development server, and the commands is npm, it should be npm run dev. Okay, so our server now is up and running on the port 3000. So we should be able to do something like this: localhost 3000 /. Okay, this is great and all, but like, how do we scale this and how do we write larger applications? So if we go back to the Hono documentation and we go under guides and go under best practices, I'm not going to sit here and read through all of this, but I will skip down to building a larger application. And here's a quick example of how you would do this. Okay, so what I will do is go ahead and go back. All right, I'm just gonna open up Visual Code. Okay, so I'll go ahead and create a new directory. I'll just call it services. And here in the services directory, this is where we will define all of our routes and all of our controllers and all of the logic. And for this simple example, I have soccer data. So I'll just go ahead and label it season TS, and I'll head back to the documentation and let's see. So I'll just go ahead and copy this code, and I won't use all of it, right? So I'll paste it here, and what we need to do is I only want to post method. And then the other thing that we need to do as well is give this endpoint a unique name. So for example, we can label it season. So anytime we make a post request to / season, this controller will be executed. I'll go ahead and update the text for now. Okay, so now that we have defined our route name, the type of HTTP request that can be made against this route, and the controller, we just need to import it into our index.ts and hook it up to our main app. Okay, so let's see. So now I'll head back over to the Hono documentation, and so what we need to do is something like this, right? So it should be something like import season from source. Nope, that's not it. There we go. Services season. And the next thing that we need to do is, right, as before, we can get rid of this. Or actually, let's go ahead and leave this route there for now. Okay, so let's go ahead and add that route. And to do that, we just reference our app object and then look for that route method. And we need to give it two things. Well, the path, right? So it can be something like /. I mean, we could just leave it / and then give it the that season router that we created. Actually, just so it's not confusing, let me go ahead and do this. I'll just do / season, and here I'll just do /. And you know what? Let's go ahead and just get rid of this as well. Okay, and so what app.route /season is doing is setting up an endpoint /season. And for that endpoint, we can only make post requests to this /season endpoint. And actually, you can define any number of HTTP methods on any single route. So for example, we can do something like this, get get request. I mean, we could do another post. I think it will get overwritten by this second post request. So what we can do is something like this, just to verify I am a second post request. So now that we've defined our endpoint /season and also defined the HTTP requests that we want to be able to make against this endpoint, how do we test our endpoints? How do we develop our APIs? And in a professional setting, the backend developer is not waiting for the front-end developer, and conversely, the front-end developer is not waiting for the backend APIs to be completed to develop the UI. So typically what happens is we sit in a bunch of meetings, we gather requirements, we make sure we're on the right page, we define an MVP, and our tech lead will go ahead and take these the requirements, create stories, and then hand them to our backend developers and front-end developers. And so as a backend developer, once you get your ticket, you don't have to wait for the front-end developer to finish the UI so you can test. And so to make sure we can test, debug, and develop these APIs, right? So we use something like this, what is known as an API client, and this is what allows us to develop and test our endpoints without a front end. And it's pretty straightforward to use. Okay, and so here, what I will do is create a new project. I'll just call it Hono.js YT. I'll just store this locally on my machine. And what I will do is create a new collection, and I'll just go ahead and call it season to reflect this service or this route season. And so now I can start adding these endpoints that I've defined over here. So in my app, I've gone ahead and defined a get and post request. So I'll go ahead and add this this get request first. So I'll just go ahead and do that. Select HTTP request, and yeah, by default I think it's get. So now I need to figure out, well, what's the URL of my server. So since I'm developing locally, the server name will be localhost 3000. So we just go ahead and take this URL, paste it here, and let's go ahead and make sure to add this /season. So now if I make a get request, and if I didn't mess anything up, we should get this response back. I am a get request. And we do. So now I'll go ahead and change the name to something more descriptive. Let me see, rename test get request. Now I'll go ahead and add a new HTTP request, and this one will be a post request. And for this, I'll go ahead and rename, I think, season maybe. So the URL will be the same, but the only thing that changes is the type of request that we're making. Okay, so now I think the second one should be executed. I don't remember if it's the first one or the last one. It might be the first one. Let's see. Yeah, so it's the first one. So for example, if you, for whatever reason, we're working late and you accidentally define 2 post requests on the same route, the very first one will be triggered and everything else will be ignored. So let me go ahead and just delete that second post request. I'll go back to this window. And actually, let me go ahead and rename this as well to just get season. So now before moving on, I just want to mention, typically when we make a post request, we're sending over a payload or we're sending over some data. And let me go ahead and go back to Visual Studio. So here we can send data over in, so one body, or two in a query parameter. So I won't really talk about the query parameter, but I'll make sure to link a Stack Overflow discussion where you can read more about what query parameters are and how and when to use them. Okay, so I'll go ahead and bring back Insomnia. And as I mentioned, a lot of the times when we make post requests or like put requests or delete requests, we want to update the data, right? And using that new piece of information, we want to do something to the existing data, whether it's updating it or deleting it or whatever it is that we have to do. And so one way we can send data over to this endpoint is in the body. So I'll go ahead and just choose JSON, some ID. Okay, I think maybe it wants double quotes and no trailing. Yeah, okay. Right, and a lot of the times the payload is just JSON. That's all it is. And the structure of the payload or the JSON that is sent over is something that the backend and front-end engineers decide on through multiple meetings. Anyways, here I'm just adding a couple of fields. Okay, so I'll go ahead and make another post request to this endpoint. And we see that the request was successful. Okay, and so now how do we access this payload or this data that we're sending over to our endpoint, right? How do we access that data in our controllers or in this function that handles how to respond to the client? Right, if you recall earlier, I showed you the Express documentation and mentioned how this request and response object is automatically inserted by Node.js with the help of C and C++. So these two objects will automatically be available to us in our middleware and controllers. If I head back over to VS Code, so Hono is doing the exact same thing. It's just slightly different. What it's doing is creating this, what Hono refers to as this context object. And to that context object, we're appending the request and that response object that is automatically handled by Node.js. So to access that, all we need to do is, reference the context object and reference that, I believe it would be request. I don't remember. Let me see. Body maybe. Yeah, rec dot. Okay, let me try that. What's going on? I see. Okay, finally I figured it out. I forgot how to do it, but anyways, what we need to do is, again, access this context object, and on that object, we're gonna have this request object, and then this request object has this method, JSON, so we just need to invoke that to get some JSON back. And now we just need to send back a response, and here we're sending a 200 with whatever was in the body or whatever was sent in the payload from the client. Okay, and so now we're ready to make that that post request to this endpoint. And so once I click send, the server will respond with a status code of 200 and with whatever was sent from the client. Okay, so I'll go ahead and make that request. And as you can see, we're just sending back the data that was sent in the incoming request. Okay, and so the last thing that we need to do is figure out how to integrate Supabase into our Hono app. Okay, so I'll go ahead and head over to the Supabase webpage. I already have an account, so I'm not going to go through that process. Once you have created your account, you want to head over to your dashboard. And as you can see, I have my own organization with 2 projects. So I'll go ahead and create a new project for this video. I'll go ahead and call it Hono YT. As for the password, I'm just going to choose something easy that I can remember because I will most likely delete this project after this video is done. And for the region, you don't have to do anything. It should default to the closest one to you. Okay, I'll go ahead and create the project. Okay, so now that we've created our new project or database, we need a few things. So we need to install the Supabase client. We need to locate the URL or the URI for our database. And we also need an API key. And with these three things, we should be able to query our database from within our Hono app. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is, let's go ahead and set up these environment variables. Go ahead and go to VS Code, and I'll create a new file, .env, and this should be, yeah, that's at the top level. So I'll just go ahead and name them Supabase URI. Now I'll just leave it as an empty string, and then Supabase key. Okay, so where do you find these two environment variables? So if I go over to the Supabase webpage, after your project is created, you should see this page. So all you need to do is just scroll down. Okay, so under project API, you should see project URL and API key. So we'll go ahead and take this first one and copy the contents and put them under Supabase URI. We'll go ahead and do the same thing for the API key, and I'll just go ahead and save that file. So the next thing that we need to do is install the Supabase client. So if we head back to the Supabase webpage, if you look down here, you can see that we're importing this Supabase client from this package. So I'll go ahead and just copy this. I'll go back to VS Code, and I'll do an npm I and install the Supabase client. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is set up the database. So under source, I'll just create a new file called db.ts, and I'll go back over to the Supabase webpage. I'll just go ahead and copy this and back over to VS Code, paste. What we need to do here is do something like this: Supabase URI, and then do the same thing over here. Supabase. What is this complaining about? Even if type string is not assignable to. Okay, so this is complaining because it's possibly undefined. And since the purpose of this video is to learn how to set up a backend, we don't have to dwell on this error message. So what I'm gonna do for now is just hit it with the bang. And so this is known as a non-null assertion. Essentially is stating that, yes, this value will not be undefined. I know it's there, unwrap it. I'll go ahead and do the same thing for the second environment variable. And before moving on, I just want to point out that when we're learning, you want to do your best to keep moving because it's just so easy to get sidetracked in all these details. I'll go ahead and save that file. Also make sure to export that. Okay, so now what we can do is go back to our season file, and here we can do something like this. We can, I think it's, let me see. Right, so now we import our database. We can go over to our web browser and look up the Supabase client documentation. We can head over to the fetch data section, and we can go ahead and copy and paste this code. Okay, so for now, I'm going to ignore the post request, and I'm only going to focus on the get request. Okay, so if we get an error, we want to handle that error appropriately. So we can do something like if error turn something like, I don't know, status Okay, so in my case, if we have an error, I'm just going to create this custom object, right? I'll put a status code of 404 and a simple message to give us a little bit more information. And I'll just go ahead and make sure to pass in that second argument to this JSON method. So here I'm assuming everything went well and we just don't have the particular season that we're looking for. So in this case, it'll be a 404, but we also have to think about other cases as well. Anyway, so if we have the data, we'll just go ahead and do we'll send back a 200 and we'll just send over the data. Okay, so this won't work just yet because we still need to set up a table in Supabase. But I'll go ahead and bring our query client up and I'll query our get endpoint just so we can see what happens. Okay, cannot connect to server. Okay, so something happened. Okay, so I know what's happening. So here, it's not reading our environment variables. 1 second. Okay, right, so I need to install this. Where is it at? .env. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and quickly do that. npm i.env. Then I just need to head over to index at the very top. I need to make sure to import .env. Yeah, that should do it. Okay, let's try one more time. npm run dev. Okay, so it looks like we connected to our database. Okay, now let's go ahead and bring up Insomnia one more time, and let's go ahead and try this request again. Okay, so as expected, this is throwing an error, and if I go over to that season file, and as you can see here from our query client, this is what we are responding with. We're sending back this object with a status and message property, as well as setting the status code to 404, as you can see up here. 404 not found. Okay, so let's go ahead and fix this issue. If we head back to our Supabase webpage, go to, I believe, yeah, it's database. And here, as you can see, we don't have any tables. So we'll go ahead and do that. We'll create a new table. But before we do that, we need some data. So if you head over to my GitHub page and head over to my footballers repository, go to source, you should see a data directory where I have a bunch of CSV files with data. So I'll go ahead and download the first one. Yeah, just download. Okay, so I'll head back over to our project. And for the table, I'll just go ahead and label it season 2004. And for a description, I'll just go ahead and put Barcelona football stats for season 2004. So I myself am still learning about Supabase, and I will go ahead and leave this enabled, but you should at some point read a little bit more about this. Okay, so now that we have some data in the shape of a CSV file, we can go ahead and use that file to create our table. So I'll go ahead and import that. And I'll click save. Okay, so here it's complaining that we need a primary key, and again, this video is not about database design, it's just about how to set up a database and connect it to a backend so you can play around with it. And so that's another thing that you can learn and read about, which you should. But for now, I'll go ahead and let me see if okay, so you definitely shouldn't do this, and I just want to keep this video moving along. I will go ahead and select name as my primary key so that we can start playing around with this data. And finally, I will hit save. Okay, if I head over back to Visual Studio Code, and if I go to the season file, so this line of code under the hood is executing the following SQL. Select star, meaning everything, from the table countries. But we don't have a table countries. What we do have is a table named season 2004. So we can go ahead and update this to season 2004. Okay, I'm just gonna bring up my server. Okay, it's looking good. Now I'll bring up the query client and I'll try once more. Okay, so as you can see, we're getting back an empty array, even though we have data. And so as we're learning about databases and how to create backends, for now, it's okay to circumvent this. And to do that, you go over back to the Supabase webpage. No, I think it might be under database. Here we go. I think it's gonna be under policies. Right, so as I mentioned earlier, you should at some point read about this, and this is why we are getting back an empty array. So what we need to do is create a policy. So for the policy name, I'll just go ahead and just call it learning. For policy behavior, I'll leave it as is, right? And so for the policy command, we only want to be able to read from this table. And then for the target roles, I think authenticated should work. And then this, I don't think we need to touch. And all we need to do now is just save the policy. Please provide an SQL expression for the using statement. Oh, crap, I don't remember this. Using statement, I don't remember. Supabase using statement policy SQL. Okay, and so for the using policy, I've selected authenticated, right? And so for this using statement here, since I've selected authenticated, I will go ahead and use this right here, right? True. Okay, so if I go back to this tab, okay, so I'll go ahead and put true here, and this should work. Okay, now if we go back to our query client and execute this request one more time, we should get some data back, or not. Okay, and so if we look under API key, we see that we have these two roles. So I believe this would be anonymous and this would be public. And if we just quickly reference the documentation, yes. So anon is an unauthenticated request. So the user isn't logged in. And since I haven't set up an authenticated role, I'm gonna go back to this tab and I will update this policy. I'll go ahead and select anonymous, remove authenticated. And if we go back to the documentation, looks like, yeah, it's still the same. Go back to this tab. Okay, this looks good. I'll go ahead and save the policy one more time. Okay, so now I head back over to my query client. This should work this time. So you can see now we have data. And now we can start playing around with this data. Okay, so this video took a lot longer than I thought, and I'm gonna go ahead and end this video right here. And it doesn't matter what language you're using, the process is more or less the same. In this case, since we use Supabase, I didn't really get to talk about what ORMs are. And actually, I'm gonna make a whole nother video on database design. And also for next steps, what you can do is if you go under guides, you can go ahead and you can go under testing and read more about how to test your web server. Anyways, the purpose of this video and all my videos are to learn how to think about the bigger picture, because once you land a developer role, no one is going to be holding your hand. You have to figure this stuff out on your own. However, that's not to say that we don't need mentors, but this is the reality of being a software dev. You have to be proactive. You have to learn how to figure things out on your own. And the way you do that is by focusing on the fundamentals. Anyways, thanks for watching and hopefully you found this video useful.